Okay, so today we are here with Nicholas Pearson, who is the author of Stones of the Goddess, Crystals for the Divine Feminine. And Nicholas, first of all, I want to tell you, I'm very excited to have you here today. After reading your books, I'm just amazed. So welcome to Reiki Radio.
Thanks so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Oh, so am I. So as I mentioned in the intro, you are a Reiki master teacher, as well as obviously an expert on stones and crystals and minerals. And I really wanted to talk to you today about crystals because so many people have questions about them. And there's this, I guess you would say, maybe resurgence of connection to the crystals, which you also talk about in the book as also this reconnection to the divine feminine. But before we get into all of that, I wanted to ask you first, what even led you into being so connected to minerals and crystals and such?
So this is it's something that's woven into every fiber of my life. I am just interested in crystals from the scientific, the mineralogical side, from the cultural, historical, anthropological side, as well as the sort of woo-woo, how does this feel? What energies does it have kind of side? And it started really early. A lot of people on the spiritual path kind of have maybe an experience of religion, and that leads them to go in a different direction later in life. My father was raised very Catholic, which meant I wasn't really raised much of anything. And that gave me an opportunity to kind of explore and think for myself rather than going to church on weekends. We went to the library, my dad and I, and that was kind of like our cathedral of learning. And one week it might be books on mythology and folklore and fairy tales, and the following week it might be a stack of books on ancient history, and then here comes the science. So I've always kind of had an interest in many different fields at once. But even early in life, I started to see connections between the sort of more mythic or poetic stories and the natural phenomena, the science that they were representative of. And eventually I just decided that when I made my spiritual path my focus, I wanted to keep a foot in both of those worlds, because it's really telling the same story with two lexicons, two sets of vocab, and it's just amazing. But my crystal collection began in earnest maybe around the age of 8. Before that, my grandfather had been kind of observing the fact that I'd been picking up stones everywhere I went, out in the driveway, on the beach, go up to the mountains on vacation. And so he gifted me with my first piece of quartz, and that was life-changing. And suddenly stone was not just this inert substance that was out in nature, but it was, just totally magnificent. You have those regular angles, the way the light moves through it. There was something really comfortable and predictable about the shape, the form, the structure of it, but there was something totally mystical at the same time. It reminded me of something out of, a fantasy story. So,
Yeah.
I've been collecting ever since, and I kind of found a way to merge that with my spiritual path. Back in the day when Amazon was not quite so prolific, or maybe when it didn't quite exist, you found books on spiritual topics by visiting your local big box retailer. Maybe if you got lucky, there'd be a spiritual shop nearby. And by the time I was in my teens, I'd been able to pick up a few books on crystal healing and look at some books on folklore, on the stones. And I started to just combine that with my own natural experiences with them and sort of tell a story. And that led me to teach for the first time at the ripe old age of 18.
Wow.
And I have not stopped since.
It's interesting hearing you say that, because now it also explains your book itself and the way that it's written. And I told you when we spoke before, I was amazed at how much I learned just in the first 15 pages of the book. I mean, you do an amazing job of blending, the technicalities of it all, and even explaining and breaking down the difference between stones and minerals and crystals and gemstones. But what I also loved so much about your book was the element of folklore and even what people believed in ancient cultures and the connection to the divine feminine. So while this is a great book to learn about crystals, I can't wait to go more into this with you, but I learned so much about the divine feminine in of itself. And I thought that was really fascinating. I mean, it's amazing the way you've structured this book and the way you put it all together. Anyone who reads this will walk away feeling very well informed, and I think even more curious because of the way the book is structured. So I had to take notes because that's how juicy this book is, right? For the questions I wanted to ask you. So one of the first things I thought was really cool is the way you do break down just the basics about crystals. And I want to ask you about that, the different functionality and how we can use them. And even with that as well, what do you think, what is the draw, or why do you think that crystals are becoming so popular again in modern times?
Um, you know, let's start with that last piece.
Okay.
I think it's so timely because in a way our society these days is so disconnected from nature, from Mother Earth. And so when, we pick up our favorite stone, we are holding a piece of Mother Nature. We can carry that with us. We can remind ourselves of our inherent connection to the natural world. There's no way to escape the influence of Mother Nature, of the planet itself, no matter how high up you are in a skyscraper or how, hidden you might be in some sort of technological cave. Everything around us ultimately comes from natural sources. It gets processed quite a lot, whether it's the wood pulp that becomes the paper in the books that we read, whether it is the copper wiring that allows us to have electricity, or the gypsum, the selenite that's in our um, uh, plaster in the walls. We're always surrounded by these natural materials that have just been highly processed. So I think having something in its raw state, bringing that piece of nature into our lives, is something that we really need.
Right.
And on the other hand, I think there's this sort of primal memory. Stones were our first tools, our first ornaments, our first teachers. We kind of poetically think of our earliest ancestors as even living in caves, homes made of stone. And this is something that's like woven into our DNA. So as we evolve, as we grow, as we change, and we see the world continuing to adapt, we're calling upon our most ancient teacher, our longest serving friend and ally in the natural kingdom. And that is the world of stone.
That is amazing. So even with that too, because I'll say this, for example, I know, so many people are excited for this interview too because of the curiosity about crystals and stones. And I think a lot of us find we're just naturally drawn to certain stones or crystals and these things. And that ties into as well, I want to ask you again of, how we use them or how they can support us. But in your experience, what is that? Like our connection to them? Is it because of our makeup? Is it because of because you speak in the book too about energy and how when we come into contact with each other and with everything being energetic, that we go into communication with each other. So do you think that's part of the draw to the crystals, the way they're communicating with us, even if we don't consciously understand it?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, let's take a look at that energy piece. When we have systems that are in movement, systems that vibrate, that oscillate, they generate fields of energy. Um, so the more highly ordered a substance or system is, the more highly ordered its energy field is going to be, and we call that state of order and precision coherency. I am a biological system. I am in a constant state of flux. I am ever changing. My energy is anything but coherent,
Mhm.
and that's just the nature of life. So when my energy field comes into contact with something like quartz or calcite or granite, it's made up of components that are crystalline, that have this regular repeating structure, this periodicity to them that creates a very coherent structure and therefore very coherent energy. And when these two things kind of overlap, there is a process that can occur called entrainment, wherein a field will bring another field into harmony with it, based on the amplitude or the volume of that signal. In the metaphysical world, we talk a lot about frequency,
Yes.
but amplitude is a really important part of the equation. So frequency is kind of like the station you tune into on the radio. You've picked your favorite station, you're tuned into your favorite frequency, you're ready to go out into the world. Well, amplitude is the volume knob. It's how far that signal travels.
Mm.
And highly ordered systems naturally have a higher amplitude. Um, so when we work with crystals, we come into harmony with that. And as we become more ordered ourselves, it's like expanding that light that we radiate, or we're cranking up the volume on our energy field. And it's just this beautiful synergy that takes place.
Yeah, that is amazing. You remind me of two things I wanted to share with. I actually thought of you recently in reading your book. I went hiking, and it's not something I normally do, but I was out in nature, and there were these, beautiful trees and these boulder rocks. All of it was beautiful, and I felt so drawn to put my hands on these different rocks. Now, normally, I think even honestly, prior to reading your book, I think I just thought of like crystals as, these tools of information, even though understanding that, there's information in all things, right? But I was so drawn to this one rock in particular, and I put my hands on it, and I felt I was in communication with this rock. And it was interesting. And I thought of you, and I was like, oh, I can't wait to tell him about this experience. But so in all of this, like when we are connecting with different crystals and different stones, specifically, are we then, with what you're saying, are we harmonizing with them because they are more stable than we are?
In theory, yes.
Okay.
We're going to find those stones that are their energy signature is so far removed from ours that instead of immediately drawing us into that state of harmony, they actually create dissonance.
Mm.
We've all felt that beautiful gemstone. We thought it was going to be wonderful. We picked it up, and that feeling the pit of your stomach goes, or maybe your head hurts, or you just immediately have this revulsion to it. Those are probably our greatest teachers.
Mm.
It's great to find the crystals that give us that warm, fuzzy feeling that immediately take us into that entrained state where we're harmonized with it. But it's the ones that are really dissonant, the ones that really shake things up, that represent something so far outside of yourself that it is a lesson that maybe your soul has never mastered.
Uh,
And so those are the really profound teachers. And it's not an instant, hey, let's sync up and we're on the same wavelength. Great, let's go through life. It's definitely one of those things where we have to kind of approach it respectfully. That's why a lot of these really we'll say high vibration or high frequency crystals that people rave about can be so jarring at the beginning, because it's an energy so far outside of our ordinary everyday life. So yes, they do bring us into harmony, but oftentimes it's the ones that are so far removed from our natural state that cause anything but harmony in the beginning that can be really profound healers.
wow. So is it, in a sense, even you saying it that way, that if we pick up a particular stone and maybe we don't feel connected to it, or it does feel uncomfortable to us, is it bringing forward maybe like coding or information in our field that we have suppressed, like that type of?
Yeah, that can totally be it. So, all crystal structures from a sort of metaphysical standpoint have these 5 essential crystal functions, um, which we started to get to earlier and never got around to. And one of those is really based on like the optics of crystals, and they both reflect and they refract, and that allows them to show us what's happening under the surface. So you pick up your favorite piece of quartz, hold it in sunlight, you're gonna get the right angle, the critical angle. It's called, and the whole face will go white and reflect light into your eyes. You can't see into the crystal anymore. So that's kind of a symbolic representation of what's happening energetically.
Mm.
When we approach things from the right angle, they can show us what's happening at the surface level or below, and they're able to take that light that we emanate and redirect it back to the conscious mind, so we can become aware of it, that that level of everyday thought. But by the same token, if we change the angle, light passes through that crystal and it breaks that white light into all of its incident components. And so we create beautiful rainbows. Another way that refraction occurs is not by breaking light into its spectrum, but by bending the angle it goes through. And so, crystals and things with crystal structures have this ability to do that as well. Show us the component pieces of an underlying pattern, as well as change the way the pattern is moving altogether. If we follow that hermetic principle of correspondence, as above, so below, as below, so above, and so on and so forth, the things that we see evidenced in the material plane are going to be representations of things that are happening in the immaterial planes. And that's why approaching crystals from that sort of scientific viewpoint can be so helpful, because we can see the models of how it's going to work.
That's interesting you say. So it brings me to wanting to ask you about how we work with them in two very specific ways, right? So on one hand, a lot of people use crystals in like obtaining information or even accessing their unconscious mind, even reading, right? Like people do scrying, or I tend to hold this crystal in particular when I'm meditating and these types of things. So on one hand, what can be revealed to us with crystals and through crystal work is the information within our own fields, right? But then on the other hand, say like in the book, there's a section where you talk about crystals with magical practices and as well as in ritual, which was amazing too. It seems like we have this other aspect of relationship we can go into with them, where then we're more highlighting what they can do. So, I mean, not just, revealing to us what may be in our field or in the field of someone that we're reading, but like using grids and these types of things. Then there's this whole other aspect of how crystals can be used and amplified, right? So could you talk to us about those two different ways and how we can use them to support us in these different practices?
Sure. So, there's a common thread through all of the ways that we work with crystals, and that common thread is conscious relationship.
Okay.
I can throw a string of amethyst beads around my neck and go about my day and never give it a second thought. And I'm sure, I guarantee you, the amethyst is doing something behind the scenes. But instead of treating it as an inert tool, if I approach crystals respectfully, I'm going to recognize that they have a life cycle of their own. And no, I'm not talking about biological life and consciousness in the same way that we have, but there is an essence, a spark, a soul to all things that have form, whether it's physical form we can lay our hands on or form in other realms. And so if we remember this and we frame our work with crystals with that idea, then instead of doling out instructions to this tool or just wearing this tool to have with me in case I need it, I really have to be a little bit mindful about what mission the crystal has. It's had a much longer life than I've got, and it will continue long after this physical form of mine is gone. So when we think about things this way, we can come into that conscious relationship. And whether we're doing the sort of personal meditations, wearing them, carrying them, sitting with them, or doing more complex things, the more externally focused things like creating grids or maybe making crystal elixirs or using them in a therapeutic context with ourselves or our clients, it's that idea of conscious relationship. I would be remiss if I started to use a crystal on a client before I'd done any work with it on myself, because I need to forge that friendship. It's a lot like meeting a new human being. We can send a text here or there and just know them on a very superficial level, but we really have to invest time and effort into that relationship if we want to get anything out of it. Show up for coffee, be there when they need us, they'll be there when we need them. And that becomes so much more meaningful than a passing "hey, what's up" kind of text. And it's the same with our stones. It's great to stick it in your pocket and have it with you as you go about the world, but check in with it, and don't just give it instructions. Take time to listen.
That's a really good advice, and I think that'll be helpful for a lot of listeners as well, because I don't know that we all consider going into relationship with the stones as much as we, you'll hear people say like, oh, rose quartz is for love, and so people will just, stick the stone or give the stone for those particular things, but not necessarily connect with them like you're saying. So when you say that too, it reminds me of you talking about dedication and consecration with the stones themselves. So can you talk about ways that we can start to build these relationships or set intention, this conscious relationship that you're talking about?
Yeah. So, um, you know, I would say when I was really going down the rabbit hole with crystals for the first time, a lot of the better texts that were available on the U.S. market were being written by English authors. At that point, they already had a lot of infrastructure for training on crystals, and into the early 2000s as well. And there's like a whole piece of the puzzle, a whole part of their methodology that never really translated to North America on a widespread scale, and it's the idea of dedication. And in my magical practice, this seems very parallel to the idea of consecration, which literally means to make sacred. And it's after you get your new stone, you cleanse it for the first time, even before you use it for anything in particular. Dedication is the idea that you are devoting this sacred tool, this sacred being, to work that is going to be for the highest good of all parties involved, that it will be never misused, that essentially what you're saying is, I respect this crystal, and in return, that crystal will respect me. And so we can do that with a very simple cleansing, sitting in meditation, and just affirming that, and holding space for the crystal to affirm that back to us.
Yes.
Even if we don't hear words, see colors, have any sensation in our hands, if we still quiet the mind and give space, it's going to happen. Sometimes we have to fake it till we make it, especially depending on which kinds of maybe intuitive faculties or psychic faculties we've got. We don't all receive information or confirmation the same way. So that can be this wonderful open door to saying, hey, you know what? I really value, love, and respect this presence in my life. And it's not just this inert tool that I'm going to use as a means to a specific ends.
Mm-hmm. Hearing you say that too, and I just want to let everyone know, if they are curious about some of these aspects we're talking about, you go into great detail about all of it within the book. And one of the things I want to ask you about now too are crystal grids specifically. And I know a lot of people are interested in them. I have a friend that, she grids for everything. And I think the grids are fascinating in that, from my understanding of them, it seems like you can not just amplify energy around certain intention or connection to, like even in your book, talking about connecting to the goddess itself, herself, but that the energy is continually generating, like different than like us, where we may think of something, walk away, and then it's just like out of sight, out of mind, right? But you give great detail and steps of how to do all of these things. So with grids, I thought it was really interesting that in one of them specifically I saw, and you do talk about this in several of them actually, about the order of the stones and the shape of the grid, on top of the different elements you can include, not just the right stones, but other elements in creating the grid. So do you have some, I guess you say, like basic tips for people about grids and why we would even create them?
Sure. So let's talk about what a crystal grid is first and foremost, for those who might not know. So like in my sphere, I define a grid as an intentional geometric arrangement of crystals made for a specific outcome. Now, a lot of these things can kind of have flexible parameters on them. The specific outcome might be just entering into conscious relationship with my stones and intuitively letting them tell me where they need to be. I don't know what the grid is for other than that connection, but that's still intentional.
Yes.
We can't pull our stones out of our pocket at the end of the day and just kind of drop them on the dresser and call that a crystal grid either. Yeah, there's probably some geometry to that, but it's not quite as intentional. There's no conscious direction as far as an outcome goes. So grids can be simple. You need, arguably, I'd say at least 3 crystals to make a grid, but you can have, hundreds. I've made grids that take up entire rooms.
Wow.
I had some really tolerant roommates in college, and they can also be really petite. You can make little mini-sized grids that you can place in a safe place. Somehow affix them to something that you can carry with you even. So grids are these amazing tools because they are subject to the law of synergy, wherein something, a whole entity is greater than the sum of its parts. So when we work with crystal grids, it's not an additive thing where the frequency and amplitude of this crystal is added to the frequency and amplitude of this crystal and the next one and so forth. It becomes exponential, it becomes multiplicative. And that allows us to create a greater sphere of influence. Grids can be almost like mandalas that reflect things from our subconscious. We can use them like magical sigils. In this book, I took kind of a different approach to my grid making and made them a little bit more symbolic in their form and structure to have that sort of magical feel, like some sign or glyph that's taken from astrology or alchemy or just sort of the collective conscious. But we can also be really formulaic about it. And I tend to be more on that side, or very free form. I don't often occupy that middle space. And we can look at things like the geometry, the numerology, the relationships of the stones from one to another. You can look at color and size and shape of the stones themselves, as well as the outer form. In my next book, coming out hopefully soon, that will go a little bit more into detail into that more formulaic side. But one day I want to have a whole book just on grids because they're so profound, and it really speaks to relationship in general. If we get such big effects from a few crystals added together in a cohesive way, imagine what happens when human beings do the same thing and we come together and we have that level of coherency as a group.
Right.
Big ripples in the universe.
You just made my mind go in 10 different directions. One, I just want to say really quickly, if anyone goes on Amazon and you look up his book, this one in particular, The Stones of the Goddess, this is the one we're discussing, but Amazon gives you the option of clicking on the author. Click on Nicholas Pearson because he's written several books about crystals and such. And you also, I do want to point out as well, this book, Foundations of Reiki Rojo, this book that you wrote was so good that I actually used it as a manual for the last Reiki class that I taught.
Thank you.
Amazing book. So just want to show this. And of course, I'll put links in the show description so people can find them very easily. But one of the things that you said in that as well, it made me really think about that communication again, like what you were speaking about before, because while the intention that we may have in building a grid and how it is working, it's interesting that like our consciousness can work together with the consciousness of the crystals, and just how I think it highlights our nature in a way that we don't tend to think about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's very, very interesting. So you also talk about, and you just reminded me of this, the charm bags that you speak about in the book as well, in ways that we can, it's almost like the little medicine bags that people carry, right? So
Yeah.
I want to ask you about that. And I have a client who actually, she jokes and calls them her bra crystals, but she takes one of the little Tiffany bags and she puts crystals, whichever one she chooses for the day, and she literally carries them around in her bra in the little thing. But these little charm bags of crystals, what do you recommend that someone may create this for or use it for, wearing it on their person?
Yeah, so these kind of magical pouches have parallel histories in a lot of different parts of the world. We see them as like the Griri pouch from the Afro-Caribbean traditions, as charm bags, mojo bags, spell pouches. They get tons of different names depending on the culture of origin, but these are like portable spells. It's a way for you to create this ritual tool that becomes a physical token to remind you of the magic that is innate within you. You know, these are external tools, but they're really reflecting the magic happening in our heads and in our hearts and above and beyond. Um, so they're also subject to that law of synergy. The ingredients that we combine together can be very simple or very complex, but they enter into relationship with one another. When I talk about this in the book, I give you some specific instructions, think of them as kind of like recipes.
Mm-hmm.
So the herbs, oils, the stones, anything else that might be in there is chosen pretty intentionally. So generally, if we want to devise these for ourselves, especially if we're a relatively newcomer to this type of magical tradition, get yourself a couple of reference books on the other ingredients you might use. So Stones of the Goddess will have tons of correspondences for crystals, but you might want to look into herbs or essential oils or other tools that you feel comfortable adding, and you can just kind of line them up. There is definitely an art to it, and I'm no expert in the art of crafting these things. These were inspired by my very simple personal practice, but spell pouches can be great. They can be a very permanent thing. You know, I tie them up and that's it, it's sealed. So you probably don't want to put your favorite crystal into a pouch like that. And then, we see things like the medicine bags and medicine pouches, especially among the native peoples of the Americas. But these are, ever evolving and changing in some cases. They're full of stones that we might take out and use in ritual meditation or healing. They might be more of like this totem of our spiritual power that we just carry with us. So something like that can be a little bit more collaborative. It can be something that is more customizable over time. So, but both are great ways to bring our stones with us into the everyday.
As you're saying that too, it reminds me of going back to you talking about entrainment in the beginning. The same client in particular, I mean, she would have them, in her bra, in her pockets, and in Reiki sessions, she would hold one in each hand. And she and I had the most amazing sessions together. And now, having this conversation with you, it was interesting that because obviously there was the influence of the crystals as well. And she and I would literally have the same visions, the experiences of our connection beyond, the conscious mind in those sessions were just unreal, that we started to joke about like, oh, I wonder what we're going to see today, what the crystals are going to reveal to us today. But they really, those sessions were unlike any other that I've ever had. And we both knew that the crystals were a part of it. And even though, at the time, I wasn't in relationship with her crystals, they definitely still had an impact on me just by being in that state.
Absolutely. And I think we could probably use the associative property here. Your client was in relationship with her crystals. You were in relationship with her client. And therefore, if you and her were synced up and she and the stones were synced up, you and the stones were synced up too. The crystal is amazing in the way that it works like that, because they don't have egos, they don't have expectations, they don't have the sort of malleable worldview that we do. So they're just there. They're beings of service. So, even I'm sure those tiny little ground up pieces of selenite in our walls and the drywall, the gypsum crystals, is still there holding light, because they're just so service oriented like that.
That is amazing. So one of the things too, I have to ask you about, especially because there is so much information in the book about the goddess. One of the things that you said that I'm hoping you'll elaborate on, in the book you said the goddess herself changes and adapts to the ebb and flow of consciousness. And I was like, wow, that's so interesting. So I wanted to first ask if you can let everyone know how the goddess is even referenced in this book in relationship to crystals. Like, what is that connection to goddess and crystals?
I suppose it's probably about time we get there, right?
Yeah.
Stones of the Goddess. She's right there in the title. I grew up as a queer person without a firm religious background of my own. And I never really felt comfortable with this idea of some old white dude with a beard sitting on a throne in the sky, watching everything that I was doing and knowing every thought that came into my head. I mean, the idea of this was mortifying. But it also felt like wow, all of these people have this imaginary friend who's not very friendly. Like, I don't get it.
Right.
So when I started to sample from the buffet of world spiritualities and religions, the things that really held my sway the longest were earth-based spiritual paths. Um, you know, I for a long time have self-identified as a pagan and a witch, and those things have kind of come and gone. You know, they were really strong labels for me in my teenage years and early 20s, and then they didn't mean anything to me anymore because I didn't have the time or energy to focus on my craft. I was no less spiritual, but I'd found other tools. You know, I studied esoteric Buddhism, and you know, lately it's like Japanese folk religion that has my heart. And we'll save that for another day. But I've kind of come back into a more conscious partnering with the Great Mother. The idea of divinity being plural felt really good to me. The idea of divinity not being relegated to a specific gender expression felt really good to me in those early days. And no matter what labels I've used or disused, those have been themes that have stuck with me. And I consider myself a bit of an animist. I believe there's an animating force, spark, soul, consciousness in all things that have form, whether it's manifest physical form in the material plane or not. And it only makes sense that you know, again, if we go back to those Hermetic teachings, if we look at the first one, the principle of mentalism, everything is mind first. Well, there's got to be one mind that thought of us all, the heart mind of creator. And if this is something that I conceive of everything in the manifest and unmanifest worlds, it's way too big for my little tiny human brain to wrap around. So I think this is a common thread through human history. And so we've had to compartmentalize that. And we've had to kind of say, wow, this thing is bigger than all of us. We're all part of it. We're not separate from it, but it's too big for us to conceive of. And so we start to break that down. We break it apart. We put it through the prism, through the crystal, and we see the component rays. So we see the masculinity, we see the femininity, we see the androgyny, we see the things that are above and beyond those things. And then we start to see separate faces or identities or personalities that are manifest within those individual streams as well. And that's kind of in my personal worldview, how we kind of end up with all these different pantheons of deities. I'm not really a hard polytheist or a soft polytheist. I'm somewhere between the two because I believe the gods are as separate as you and me. So here we are, separate, you know, separate bodies. We're talking from separate parts of the country, but I don't believe you and I are really all that separate either.
Right.
So connecting to the goddess for me has been a really life-affirming thing. It's allowed me to own my own kind of liminality in a heteronormative society, in a very, you know, a world that isn't always friendly to people like me, to recognize that even other people who may not be aware of it have these twin streams of divine masculine and divine feminine within them, and that these are part of something also bigger than the sum of its parts. And so when we look at the goddess through this lens, we see that she is, on the one hand, static, because she is everywhere all at once and eternal. But she manifests through the world of change, the world of form. Things crumble, things are born. She's there in those places too. And when we look at the roles that goddesses have played through human culture and history, the most pervasive is the theme of Mother Earth. You go to any culture in the world that has honored the divine feminine, you're probably going to see some manifestation of the goddess who is the soul of the planet itself and all that dwells within and within and above it. So when I hold a piece of rock, of stone, a handful of sand, I am touching part and parcel of the divine body of the mother. And all of a sudden, when you look at it that way, you know, we hold that stone. I'm holding a cell of the being that is the whole universe itself. That's a really profound thing. And you know, that's kind of one of those ideas that still is too big for our minds. So you kind of get it in waves, like, holy crap, this is, I'm touching the goddess. But you know, in a Reiki session, when I lay hands on myself or on a client, I'm also touching the goddess. When I breathe, the goddess fills my lungs. When I see the photons that hit my retina, those are part and parcel of the body of the goddess too. So Stones of the Goddess was born out of the sort of inner work that I was doing, but also the need for it in the outer world. You know, we live in this society. We live in a global culture that systematically oppresses women, that oppresses people of color, that oppresses non-cisgendered, non-heterosexual people,
Mhm.
people who are non-patriarchal and non-monotheistic. And the goddess is the champion of us all. She doesn't care whether or not we worship her outright. Her symbols are everywhere. We walk on her body. We cannot be separate from her. And stones are such a clear and simple and direct way to remind us of her presence. So Stones of the Goddess was kind of born out of that, the need to bring her into the 21st century.
You are amazing. And it's so fun. I mean, listening to you, I have to tell you, part of me, I was so excited to have this conversation. And another part of me, I was nervous because I was like, man, there's so much I want to talk to him about. And there's no way we could fit it into an hour because you're just so fascinating. And all of this comes through in your writing, which is, I mean, your books are unbelievable in how well written and how informative they are. But when you just said that, it reminded me of this other part in the book where you speak about rocks and minerals facilitating the return of the great goddess. And so I wanted to ask you about that too. I mean, do you think that seeing this reconnection to crystals and the fascination with them, is that also bringing us into like deeper communication with this goddess energy and the need for it at this time?
Absolutely. As above, so below. If you look at what's happening with like the mining industry, the new things that are coming out of the earth, I say new, they're new to us. They've been inside the earth for a very long time, but it's as if they've been held in sacred trust. They've been incubating in the womb of the Great Mother until the time at which the collective reality was in either dire need of them or had evolved enough to receive them. And sometimes both of these things can be true at the same time. So when we connect to the newest crystals on the healing market, or even in the mineral specimen market, we're seeing that they reflect this brand new chapter of goddess presence in the universe. She is eternal, but she is ever changing, and that's one of the great mysteries. And so when we kind of connect with these stones, they're evolutionary, and the thing that makes them so evolutionary is the way that they're here to help us anchor and return to honoring the divine feminine. I don't propose that any crystal is the magic bullet for everything wrong with society. I don't believe that just sitting down and bowing down before the goddess is going to magically make the fabric of society better again, but I think they help. I think if we look at the lessons that these newer stones are providing, if we connect to the deeper meaning of honoring the divine feminine, we will be more respectful of one another. We will be in better relationship with the planet and take better care of our home. I think that they are tools that can inspire us to grow. And the world is a pretty dire place to be right now. We don't have the luxury of time that 2 generations ago had. They won't see the profound changes that we will see, and it's time to act now. And the crystals that are coming out that support this sort of new goddess frequency are not really just gentle reminders. Hey, evolution's a good idea. They're like imperatives. You got to do this. You got to step up. And we have to use that goddess energy. Well, I should rephrase this. We should allow the goddess energy to use us as her instruments to effect this change in the here and now, to heal the broken and fragmented divine masculine, and to achieve that greater unity when the two come together and create that bigger whole.
That is so beautiful. I'm glad you said that, because I actually think about that a lot in my personal practice, how there seems to be this deep healing and reconnection with the divine feminine, but it also, highlights the importance of the healing of the divine masculine in all of us as well. But what you're saying also reminds me of how in the book, so people know, you do reference several different stones, and you talk about their elemental signatures and even how like the cultural correspondence to the meanings that we give to the different stones, whether it be energetic or because of what they are symbolic of. And you list a lot of stones I've never even heard of. I mean, it's amazing how much detail and just how much, again, you get from this book. But when you were saying that, it reminds me of as we connect with these stones and the information that they may unlock within us, then as we become more unlocked or awakened, right,
Yeah.
we start to then amplify the same coding or information. And just like you said, kind of like the human grid, like we start to come online by way of, the support of nature and stones and Mother Earth. Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of amazing when you think of that, like seeing us all kind of lighting up and the impact that has.
Yeah, when I become a more fully self-actualized human being, I am unconsciously giving permission to the people around me to do the same.
Mm-hmm.
If the tool that I use to do that is Reiki, that's wonderful. If the tool that I used to do that is the mineral kingdom, that's also wonderful. If it's color therapy, sound therapy, meditation, whatever the tools are, they get us there. But the bottom line is that when we work on ourselves, when we create this more conscious awareness of how what we do creates ripples, then we are really impelled to do that work. When I work on me, it's not just for my personal benefit. I mean, obviously, I am directly benefiting, but the world around me, if I have less brokenness, less baggage, the world as a whole has less brokenness and less baggage. And that's kind of the message of the Great Mother. Like, we're all in this together.
Right.
We are all her children, whether you are an ant or an antelope or anything in between or above and beyond, whether you're a
Right.
single blade of grass or the whole forest. You are part of the Great Mother. You are her child. And, the mineral kingdom has never forgotten this. We are born in forgetfulness. It is our duty to forget so we can remember. And, I pick up this piece of quartz. It doesn't decide on a Monday morning when its alarm goes off at 7 o'clock that, oh God, quartz is a terrible gig. I'm going to put in my 2 weeks. I'm going to try out being hematite from now on. No, they know their life's mission, their purpose. They very faithfully put that out to the world at all times. I have the choice to be my authentic self or not. And there's no judgment there from the higher realms. I just get to do that.
Yeah.
And, the mineral kingdom so perfectly reflects to us our own light, our own truth, that it can help us course correct, help us come back home to center. And when we do that, the world is a better place. It doesn't matter what your path is. If you live that path with authenticity, the world heals.
Yeah, that is such a beautiful message. And there are a couple of things I want to ask you before we go, because we have about 10 minutes in. I do want to make sure I ask you about the different shapes, right? So,
Yeah.
like I love clusters for some reason. These are clusters, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I love them. I'm drawn to them for some reason. But then, of course, there are the spheres and all of these different shapes, double terminated. Depending on the type of work that we want to do with crystals or the way we want to communicate with them, do the shapes matter based on our intention? Or, because people do wonder, does it matter if it's polished or raw state? Does any of that matter?
Yes and no. So let's say you have this beautiful double terminated quartz crystal and then a quartz crystal sphere, and both are roughly the same mass and the same quality. Maybe they're both absolutely flawless and huge. The fundamental energy signature of a crystal is determined by factors that we can't really see with the naked eye for the most part. Things like its formation process, its internal makeup and crystal structure, and then everything else is kind of like icing on the cake. So no amount of rubbing or grinding or shaping the exterior changes those internal molecular things. So it will have the same base note that it sings at all times, but the shape of it can determine the way that energy is distributed. Do we have speakers pointed in all directions like a sphere? Do we have speakers pointing in a single direction like a wand? Do we have a symphony of many points together in a cluster? So form and function are interrelated. So if we're laying something on the body, it's nice if it's flat. It's also nice if it's not too heavy. If we want to put something in the pocket, it should be durable. It should be hopefully not sharp and pointy. So there are really practical, mundane considerations. We don't want to crush our clients to death with our most powerful, heaviest rocks. But from the energetic side, if we have something that is directional, that idea of a single point or even a double point, when it's got that termination, energy naturally flows through that. Naturally, energy is going to flow in other ways around this, but that's where it is the most noticeable.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas something like the sphere is going to radiate more gently in all directions. So we want to keep those things in mind. And then from the more symbolic side, shape speaks to the subconscious, which speaks in language, the language of symbols. So, we might marry a symbolic meaning to our work as well.
I just want to point out for everyone as well, you do talk about that in the book. I just wanted to ask you so that you could share, and you do go into detail about the different shapes. But I was so glad to hear that from you, even in our last conversation, you talking about the song doesn't change, because I did have this funny feeling when I first was introduced to crystals of thinking the polished ones were, maybe they were too tampered with and they wouldn't have the same effect. So it was really good to hear that the song doesn't change, and understanding how the different shapes amplify and direct the energy in different ways. So thank you for sharing that. But I have to ask you, do you personally have a favorite stone or
Oh,
crystal?
yes, I do. When most people ask me this, they either get the politically correct answer of, I have lots of favorites. They're all my children. You can't pick favorites. But every mom has their favorite kid.
Yeah.
Right. So my absolute favorite is Petersite. It's a distant relative of Tiger's Eye. It's not in this book, but it's in a couple of my others, and it's just absolutely enchanting. It's called the Tempest Stone because it kind of looks like these swirling storm clouds, and it helps us weather the storms of life. It's all about change and evolution and transition, and personal power and personal truth at the same time. It's got this real deep kind of like Scorpio energy with that pursuit of truth. But if I were to pick my favorite goddess-oriented stone from this book, it's a really tough choice, but it might be lapis lazuli, only because that has been such a big teacher for me in my life. It is actually, I think, the only crystal that has made it through every single one of my books, including my Reiki book. There's a tiny mention of it when I discuss one of the Reiki symbols. Tiny mention, so it makes it in this book.
That is really cool. And, I have to tell you too, I was surprised to see, so my ring that I wear, a lot of people assume it's an emerald, but it's a Savorite garnet. And garnet is my birthstone, but I had never seen green garnet before, which, blew
Right.
my mind. And a lot of people, when I tell them that's what it is, they look at me kind of like, what? So I was really excited to see that you spoke about that in the book. I was, because I've not seen
Yeah.
anyone talk about it. But it also makes me think of, I like this conversation with you, but reading the book, in that I think it reconnects the respect of all crystals, minerals, all things, because there is a lot of judgment, right? Like, like that, for example, like if someone thinks this is an emerald and I say it's a garnet, because garnet isn't a precious stone, they're like, oh, and it's like, but
Right.
they're beautiful no matter what type of crystal they are, and they all have this song that you speak about. So I like that. For me personally, in reading your book, it has given me that awareness to have a different level of respect for the crystals, and to make more of an effort to go into relationship with them and understanding them outside of the way we categorize them as like precious, semi-precious, or just a rock or whatever it may be.
Yeah, there are a lot of just plain old rocks I've picked up in my life that have had great stories to tell. Both geologically, when you look at what's happening in them, or from a maybe more mystical perspective. And even in this book, there's an invitation in there in the chapter on the triple goddess of stone to just get to know an igneous rock. It doesn't have to be the most beautiful gem quality mineral specimen formed by igneous processes. Just go out and find an igneous rock, a sedimentary rock, a metamorphic rock, and use that to connect to those archetypes of maiden, mother, and crone. There's so much we can learn from the mineral kingdom, and I think the biggest one is the lesson of stillness. With few exceptions, rocks don't move quickly. maybe some are created by some pretty big movement, but accepting the action of external stimuli. They're all about just being present. And if we slow down and we find that same stillness, magic happens, healing happens.
Yeah. Okay. So I do want to ask you this too, because I said at the beginning, this book, again, as a reader, and in my opinion, it seems like an amazing book for anyone who is interested in crystal, but also learning about the goddess. I mean, that in of itself, it serves both purposes. It's amazing. But for you, I have to ask before we go, what inspired you to write this, and who is it for? Like, who was this book dedicated to, really?
Oh, man. This was an idea that like popped into my head when I was kind of between other projects. I was still actually enmeshed in some of the early editorial work for Foundations of Reiki Ryoho. And I didn't really have time to sit down and do much else, but it was that little voice in the back of my head that wouldn't leave me alone. Like, okay, great, I'll jot some notes down, but we'll see. And it felt like a big departure from my other books in some ways. And I wasn't really sure if it was the right fit. But I'm seeing this resurgence of interest in the goddess. I'm seeing this necessity for it. So I think, like, who is the book for? As an author, you want it to be for everybody. You want everyone to rush out and buy one. But that's kind of an unrealistic expectation. I think this book is for people who want to take their crystal practice to new levels, who want to learn about new stones that have never been published about before. It is great for people whose magical and spiritual practices include honoring the divine feminine. I want it to be in some ways very scholarly, so that way further researchers on either of these fields can use it. But ideally, the book is for the goddess. When I sat down to do my writing, and especially my editing, at the behest of a dear friend of mine, I would make space beforehand, go to my altar, light a candle, sometimes some incense, and say, okay, I dedicate this time as devotional work to the goddess. I'm not making you a great offering. I'm not sacrificing any goats here. So I'm giving of my time, my energy, my keyboard. And so the book really is for her. For all intents and purposes.
That is so beautiful. And I have to say again, and you just mentioned this book, but I just want to show everyone again this book that you have, Foundations of Reiki Ryoho, a manual of Shoden and Okiden. This, if you can even see, look how many tabs I have on here. Yeah. It's
too.
Yeah, it's amazing, this book. So anyone who is interested in Reiki, practicing Reiki, even if you're a Reiki teacher, this book is a great resource. Like, I used it as a manual for the last class. And then again, Stones of the Goddess, Crystals for the Divine Feminine. I have to tell you, Nicholas, I'm excited to create my own crystal elixir. I'm going to go for the Isis one. Beautiful. Yeah, so much good stuff in here. And I thank you so very much for coming to share your work with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a beautiful conversation.
Yes, and I am going to put the links of how to contact you in the show notes, of course. But can you just tell everyone, if they want to learn more about your work right now, what's the best place to go?
So I have a pretty rudimentary website. It's www.theluminouspearl.com. You can also find me on Facebook with the Luminous Pearl page, as well as on Instagram. You can check out my publisher's website, innertraditions.com, and also head on over to Amazon. My Amazon author page has a bunch of my upcoming events, both here in North America and beyond. So, stay tuned to some of those places and you'll see some great things coming.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to say now, hopefully you'll come back to talk Reiki with us as well.
Yes,
Okay, thank you, Nicholas.
Bye.